In the dim flicker of a lantern's glow, deep within a sprawling cotton field, under a merciless southern moon, a young woman lay writhing on a blood-soaked pallet. It was 1842, and the air hung heavy with the scent of damp earth and despair. Her screams echoed faintly, muffled by the thick walls of a weathered cabin on the edge of Blackwood Plantation, a place where lives were measured not in years, but in yields. No doctor would come for her, none ever did for the enslaved. Only Eliza, the midwife, knelt beside her, her hands steady despite the tremor of exhaustion in her bones. As the woman's cries faded to a ragged whisper, Eliza whispered an ancient incantation over a steaming bowl of roots and leaves, her crazy formula that had already pulled dozens from the brink. But tonight, as the child's first breath rattled and failed, Eliza knew the shadows of this place claimed another. 200 souls would owe their survival to her in the years to come. Yet the world would forget her name, burying her genius beneath layers of silence and theft. Before we go on, subscribe and hit the bell. Here, we unearth secrets buried by official history and give voice to what was silenced. Blackwood Plantation stretched across the rolling hills of a quiet county in Georgia, its white-columned manor house a facade of southern grace hiding rot that seeped into the soil. Owned by Elias Blackwood, a man whose fortune was built on the broken backs of over 300 souls, the estate was a microcosm of the era's cruelties. Cotton fields bled white under the sun, but beneath that purity lay a darker harvest. The systematic erosion of lives, where births were both a curse and a commodity. Enslaved women, their bodies vessels for the plantation's endless labor force, faced childbirth not as a miracle, but as a gauntlet. Malnutrition gnawed at their strength, overwork twisted their frames, and the unspoken abuses of power left scars that festered in silence. Mortality rates were staggering, mothers hemorrhaging out in the night, infants slipping away before dawn. Official ledgers from the time, those sanitized tomes kept by overseers, tallied only the able-bodied workers, scribbling over the dead as mere losses to be replaced at auction. Eliza Thorne was no stranger to this grim rhythm. Born into bondage on a neighboring farm in 1810, she had been sold to Blackwood at 15, her sharp mind and gentle hands marking her for the role of midwife. Tall and wiry, with eyes that held the depth of forgotten rivers, Eliza moved through the quarters like a ghost, tending to the hidden pains that daylight dared not name. She learned her craft from her grandmother, a woman of Yoruba descent, whose knowledge crossed the Atlantic in whispers, blended with herbs from the wilds of Georgia. But Eliza innovated, driven by a desperation that clawed at her every waking hour. The plantation's women died too often, pushed beyond endurance by pregnancies forced upon them in the dead of night, or through calculated pairings overseen by the mistress herself, a program veiled as necessity but rooted in the cold arithmetic of property. It began with small observations, pieced together in the stolen moments between tasks. Eliza noticed patterns, the way certain leaves from the creekside willows staunched bleeding when brewed strong, how the bark of sassafras eased the convulsions that seized women after prolonged labor. She experimented in secret, grinding roots under the cover of moonless skies, testing on herself first during her own hidden ordeals. Whispers spread among the women, calls for Eliza's brew, that strange bitter tonic that smelled of earth and defiance. By 1845, as the plantation's population swelled under Elias Blackwood's ambitious expansions, Eliza's formula had become a lifeline. She administered it in clay cups, murmuring encouragements drawn from old spirituals, her voice a thread pulling life from the jaws of oblivion. The first real test came that sweltering summer. A woman named Ruth, heavy with her fourth child, collapsed in the fields, her body betraying her under the weight of exhaustion. The overseer dragged her to the infirmary, a shack barely fit for animals, where the plantation's meager supplies offered no hope. Eliza arrived at dusk, her satchel heavy with vials of her concoction. A blend of willow bark for pain, ginger root to steady the blood, and a rare fungus from the swamp's edge that she alone knew how to harvest without poison. As Ruth labored through the night, Eliza worked tirelessly, applying poultices and coaxing the mixture down her throat. Dawn broke with the cry of a healthy boy, Ruth's eyes meeting Eliza's in a moment of raw gratitude. Word traveled like fire through the quarters. Eliza had cheated death again. But such victories were fragile. Shadowed by the plantation's unyielding grip, Elias Blackwood, a stern figure with a ledger for a heart, tolerated Eliza's work only because it preserved his stock. He was a man of calculated benevolence, hosting church gatherings for the enslaved on Sundays while enforcing quotas that broke spirits by Monday. His wife, Margaret, embodied a different cruelty. Elegant and pious, she oversaw the women's quarters with a gaze that missed nothing, her guidance ensuring that births aligned with the plantation's needs. Rumors swirled of pacts made in the manor's study, alliances with neighboring planters to exchange breeding stock, deals inked in blood and forgotten by dawn. Eliza navigated this web with caution, her successes buying her a fragile autonomy. Yet each saved life etched deeper into her the weight of what she could not save, the ones lost to accidents in the fields or to the quiet enforcements of silence. As the years wore on, Eliza's formula evolved. She refined it through trial and error, incorporating insights from traveling healers who passed through under the guise of peddlers. By 1850, it had saved over 50 lives on Blackwood alone. Mothers who rose from their beds whole, children who grew strong enough to till the soil without faltering. The women called it her crazy elixir, laughing through tears at its unorthodox origins. But it was no madness. It was resilience forged in the crucible of erasure, a quiet rebellion against the machinery of bondage. Official records from the county courthouse, those yellowed pages we sift through today, mention nothing of it. No notations of Eliza's interventions, only vague entries of natural causes for the dead and births tallied as assets. The silence was deliberate. Plantations like Blackwood thrived on invisibility, the way communities conspired in hushed tones, elders passing stories of lost kin around evening fires, while the world beyond the gates turned a blind eye. Descendants today, scattered across generations, carry echoes of this. Family Bibles with names scratched out, oral tales of a healing woman whose gifts were stolen by the dawn of freedom. But in those mid-century years, as the nation hurtled toward fracture, Eliza's work remained a hidden flame, illuminating the human cost of empire one birth at a time. Yet even as her formula wove its quiet miracles, cracks began to form. Whispers reached the manor, a field hand boasting of Eliza's brew to an outsider, a jealous overseer noting her growing influence. Elias Blackwood's interest stirred, not in gratitude, but in possession. In the fall of 1852, he summoned her to the big house, his eyes gleaming with the opportunism of a man who saw value in everything. "What is this secret of yours, girl?" he asked, his voice laced with false warmth. Eliza stood silent, her heart pounding, knowing that to reveal it was to surrender a piece of her soul. The pact was unspoken, but it hung in the air like smoke, her knowledge in exchange for protection. Little did she know, this was merely the prelude to a greater betrayal, one that would echo across decades, waiting for the light of revelation to expose its theft. The air in the big house was thick with the scent of polished oak and beeswax candles, a stark contrast to the musty quarters where Eliza had spent her life. It was late October 1852, and the harvest moon cast long shadows through the lace-curtained windows, turning Elias Blackwood's study into a chamber of flickering secrets. Eliza stood before his desk, her calloused hands clasped tightly, the weight of her satchel, a simple burlap bag holding her precious vials, pressing against her side like an anchor. Elias leaned back in his leather chair, his fingers steepled, eyes appraising her as if she were a bolt of cotton to be weighed and valued. Margaret hovered in the doorway, her silk gown rustling softly, a silent sentinel whose presence amplified the room's tension. "Speak, Eliza," Elias said, his voice smooth as riverstone. "You've been pulling miracles from the dirt. I want to know how." Eliza's mind raced, tracing the threads of her formula back to its origins. It wasn't born of books or formal learning, but of necessity, pieced together from the whispers of the earth and the cries of the dying. Willow bark, stripped from trees along the creek to bind the blood that poured unchecked. Ginger root foraged in the underbrush to calm the tremors that seized a laboring body. And the elusive swamp fungus, a pale cluster she harvested at dawn, its essence distilled to fight the fevers that claimed so many after birth. She blended them with honey from wild hives and a touch of fermented oak gall, creating a tonic that not only eased pain, but fortified the spirit against the plantation's relentless toll. Over the years, she'd adjusted it, stronger for the malnourished, milder for the young, saving lives that the overseers dismissed as expendable, but to share it now felt like handing over a piece of her very breath. She hesitated, her voice emerging low and measured. "It's just roots and leaves, Massa. Things from the good Lord's garden." Elias chuckled, a sound devoid of mirth, and rose to pace the room. He spoke of progress, of how the plantation's yields demanded healthier workers, how her gift could extend beyond Blackwood's borders. Margaret interjected softly, her words laced with feigned concern. "Think of the women, Eliza. Your ways could spare them so much suffering." But Eliza saw the calculation in their eyes, the way Elias's gaze lingered on her satchel, the subtle nod Margaret gave him. This was no act of benevolence. It was the machinery of ownership extending its reach. In the end, under the pressure of their unyielding stares, Eliza relented, demonstrating the preparation on a small scale, her hands moving with the precision of someone who had danced with death too many times. Word of the meeting spread like mist through the quarters, carried on hushed breaths during evening gatherings. The enslaved community, bound by chains both visible and invisible, watched Eliza with a mix of awe and wariness. She had become more than a midwife. She was a keeper of hidden knowledge, her formula a symbol of quiet defiance against the forces that sought to reduce them to numbers. Yet, as winter deepened, Elias's interest morphed into something possessive. He began summoning her weekly, demanding refinements, jotting notes in a leather-bound journal that he locked away each night. Eliza complied, her heart heavy with the knowledge that her creation was slipping from her grasp. She altered recipes under his watchful eye, incorporating measurements he dictated, all while murmuring silent prayers for the souls it had saved, and those it might yet preserve. By spring 1853, the formula had transcended Blackwood's fields. Elias, ever the opportunist, shared samples with neighboring planters during their clandestine gatherings in the county's backwoods taverns. Men like him, bound by pacts of mutual benefit, traded secrets of crop rotation and labor management. But now Eliza's tonic entered the fold. A remedy for the breeding woes, Elias boasted, crediting it vaguely to plantation ingenuity. Letters exchanged among these elites, yellowed missives unearthed in attic trunks decades later, reveal the extent of their complicity. One from a planter in adjacent lands praised its efficacy. "Your elixir has steadied our stock through the season's trials, births up, losses down." No mention of Eliza, of course. She was invisible, her contributions folded into the ledger of white ambition. much like the cotton bolls picked by hands that would never own the profit. The human toll of this era's shadows weighed heaviest on the women Eliza tended. Take Lena, a field hand in her late 20s, whose body bore the marks of repeated labors, both in the rows and in the dark corners of the overseer's cabin. In June 1853, as thunder rolled over the plantation, Lena's time came early, her frame weakened by months of forced pairings designed to bolster the workforce. Eliza arrived through the pouring rain, her skirts muddied, to find Lena pale and clammy in a corner of the women's cabin. The other women gathered, their faces etched with the silent dread of too many losses. Eliza worked swiftly, administering the brew in measured sips, applying warm compresses infused with the same herbs. Hours blurred into a vigil, the storm outside mirroring the chaos within. When the child emerged, a girl, small but fierce, Lena's sobs of relief mingled with the rain's patter. "You done called her back," she whispered to Eliza, clutching the infant close. Moments like these were the formula's true legacy, threads of life woven against the fabric of erasure. But such triumphs were laced with foreboding. Elias's journal entries, pieced together from fragments preserved in county archives, show his growing obsession. He experimented on his own, diluting batches for horses and mules, then refining it for human use based on Eliza's reluctant guidance. By 1854, as tensions simmered in the nation, whispers of abolitionist pamphlets smuggled through the mails, Elias began corresponding with physicians in Charleston and Savannah. These men, educated in northern halls, yet profiting from southern bondage, expressed keen interest. "A folk remedy with potential," one replied in a letter dated March 1854, enclosing a crude sketch of chemical distillation. Eliza, overhearing snippets from the kitchen, where she was occasionally called to serve, felt a chill settle in her bones. Her knowledge, born of survival, was being dissected, repackaged for a world that would never credit her. The community's silence was a shield and a cage. Elders like old Josiah, who had walked from Virginia chains decades prior, warned Eliza in coded spirituals sung at dusk, "Keep your light hid, child, lest they snuff it out." Families clung to oral histories around hearth fires, tales of the root woman whose potions defied the grave. Yet fear stifled open talk. Descendants today, tracing lineages through faded quilts and church records, uncover these echoes in unexpected places, a great-grandmother's journal noting the healer's gift taken by the big house. The plantation's ledgers, those cold chronicles of commerce, register only the births Eliza enabled, attributing vitality to improved conditions under Elias's rule. No trace of her formula's origins, buried under layers of deliberate forgetting. As summer faded into 1855, the theft's contours sharpened. Elias hosted a physician from Atlanta, Dr. Harlan Graves, a man with a reputation for advancing Southern medicine. In the Manners parlor, under the guise of a consultation, they pored over Eliza's notes, copied without her consent. She was summoned to explain, her words twisted into scientific jargon as Graves nodded approvingly. "Remarkable," he murmured, his pen scratching furiously. Eliza saw the future in that moment, her creation stripped of its soul, patented and peddled to clinics that served the elite while the quarters languished. The pact Elias had forged wasn't just with neighbors. It was a betrayal woven into the nation's underbelly, where innovation from the oppressed was harvested like the fields themselves. Little did Eliza know this collaboration would propel her formula into obscurity for half a century, only to resurface in boardrooms far from the soil that birthed it, its savior reduced to a footnote in the margins of history. The parlor of Blackwood Manor hummed with the low murmur of voices, the air thick with the aroma of pipe tobacco and aged whiskey, as Dr. Harlan Graves settled into a velvet armchair. It was a humid evening in late 1855, the kind where cicadas droned like a distant warning, and the plantation's lanterns cast elongated shadows that danced across Persian rugs. Elias Blackwood, his face flushed with the thrill of impending gain, gestured for Eliza to enter from the shadowed hallway. She moved like a spectre, her simple calico dress a stark contrast to the opulence around her, carrying a small wooden tray with vials of her tonic. Graves, a lanky man in his 40s with wire-rimmed spectacles and a neatly trimmed beard, eyed her with clinical detachment, as if she were a specimen rather than a soul whose hands had coaxed life from the jaws of oblivion. "Tell the doctor what you've shared with me, Eliza," Elias prompted, his tone brooking no refusal. Margaret lingered by the fireplace, her fingers tracing the edge of a lace doily, her expression a mask of serene interest. Eliza's throat tightened. She had guarded this knowledge like a sacred fire, passed in fragments from her grandmother's lips during stolen nights in the quarters. But under their collective gaze, she began, her voice steady, yet laced with the weight of unspoken loss. She described the willow bark's astringent pull on hemorrhaging vessels, the ginger's warming grip against chills that followed birth, the swamp fungus's subtle fortification against the infections that festered in unsterile cabins. Graves leaned forward, scribbling notes on crisp paper, interjecting with questions phrased in the language of science, terms like astringency and antipyretic properties that Eliza had never uttered but instinctively understood through years of trial. As she spoke, memories flooded her. The face of young Mira, just 16, who had labored alone in a toolshed during a midnight storm in 1854, her body racked by the abuses inflicted to strengthen the line. Eliza had found her at dawn, pale as the mist, and administered the brew in desperate measures, blending it with rainwater to dilute the fever. The child had come still, but Mira survived, her whispered thanks a vow etched in the air. Such stories were the formula's heartbeat, born not from laboratories, but from the raw ache of watching sisters fade into the earth, their graves unmarked save for wildflowers pressed by wind. Graves nodded, his pen flying, but Eliza saw no recognition in his eyes, only the gleam of appropriation. "Fascinating," he said finally, rising to examine a vial, a crude distillation yet effective. With refinement, this could revolutionize maternal care in these parts. The collaboration unfolded in the months that followed, a slow unraveling that Eliza felt in her bones. Graves returned thrice more, each visit extending into the small hours, where he and Elias dissected her methods in the study. She was made to prepare batches under their supervision, her hands guided by Graves's precise instructions, measuring in grams rather than pinches, boiling in copper kettles borrowed from the kitchen. Elias provided the space, a locked alcove off the apothecary shed, where Eliza worked alone by day, but under scrutiny by night. The plantation's rhythm continued unchanged, fields groaning under the weight of cotton, overseers' whips cracking like thunder, women in the quarters sharing furtive glances as Eliza passed with her satchel. But now, a new undercurrent rippled through the community, whispers of the big house tonic, a perversion of her gift that Elias tested on livestock first, then on the enslaved with casual indifference. One such test came in the sweltering heat of July 1856. A woman named Clara, heavy with twins from a forced union arranged by Margaret's meticulous ledger, collapsed during evening chores. Her screams pierced the dusk, drawing Eliza from her alcove where she had been grinding fresh fungus under Graves's watchful eye. By the time she reached the cabin, Clara was delirious, blood staining the pallet, the other women hovering with cloths and prayers. Eliza pushed through, her mind a whirlwind of formulas old and new. She administered the original brew, the one untainted by their modifications, stronger, wilder, infused with the essence of resilience she alone understood. As the night wore on, one child emerged breathing, the second following, with a wail that shattered the silence. Clara, exhausted but alive, gripped Eliza's hand. "Don't let them take it all," she murmured, her eyes reflecting the flicker of a lantern. In that moment, Eliza vowed silently to safeguard the core of her creation, even as the manor's shadow loomed larger. Yet the theft progressed inexorably. Graves, with Elias's blessing, began exporting samples to medical societies in Charleston, framing the tonic as a Southern botanical innovation derived from local observations. Letters exchanged in this period, unearthed in the dim archives of a Georgia historical society, their ink faded but intent sharp, reveal the erasure at work. The compound shows promise for puerperal complications, Graves wrote to a colleague in 1857, crediting proprietary sources without a whisper of Eliza's name. Elias profited quietly, trading refined versions for favors among the planter elite. A reduced tax assessment here, a favorable verdict in a labor dispute there. The pacts deepened, sealed in smoke-filled rooms, where men like them bartered human ingenuity as casually as seed corn. Eliza, privy to fragments through kitchen eavesdropping, felt the noose tighten. Her influence waned. Women in the quarters turned to her less openly, fearing reprisal, while Elias's version, sterile, standardized, became the enforced standard. The human drama unfolded in layers of quiet devastation. Families fractured under the plantation's regime. Children separated at weaning to maximize output. Mothers bearing the invisible scars of programs that treated bodies as machinery. Oral histories preserved in the voices of descendants, gathered today from elders in rural Georgia churches, speak of this era's silences. Songs coded with warnings about the stolen root, quilts stitched with patterns mimicking herb leaves as maps to forgotten graves. The county records, those impartial guardians of truth, offer only glimpses. A spike in live births attributed to enhanced husbandry, no acknowledgement of the hands that made it possible. Eliza's own lineage blurred into anonymity. Her daughter, born in secret during a rare moment of reprieve, grew up knowing her mother's gift, but not its full cost. By 1858, as the nation teetered on the brink of war, Graves departed with a satchel of formulas, promising Elias a share of future patents. Eliza watched from the fields, her heart a hollow drum, as his carriage rattled down the oak-lined drive. The formula had saved nearly 100 lives by then, 200 across the years, if whispers from neighboring estates held true, but its spirit was fracturing. Elias, sensing the winds of change, burned his early notes in the hearth, retaining only sanitized copies. The betrayal's seeds were sown, destined to bloom in boardrooms far removed, where white-coated men would claim her genius as their own, half a century hence. In the quarters that night, under a canopy of stars indifferent to earthly theft, Eliza gathered the women and shared what remained, the untamed heart of her brew, passed in shadows, a testament to persistence amid erasure. Now I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you hear this story. I want to know how far these silenced reports reach. The years following Dr. Graves's departure marked a subtle shift on Blackwood Plantation, one that seeped into the daily grind like damp rot through old timber. It was 1859, and the air carried the faint tang of unrest. Rumors of unrest in the North, filtering through smuggled newspapers, abolitionist hymns sung softer under breath during Sunday gatherings. Elias Blackwood, ever the pragmatist, turned his attention inward, fortifying his ledgers against the gathering storm while quietly monetizing Eliza's formula through back-channel dealings. He had retained a portion of the refined batches, distributing them to select planters in exchange for alliances that promised mutual protection if war came. Eliza, relegated once more to the shadows of the quarters, watched as her creation morphed into a commodity, its essence diluted in the hands of men who saw only profit in the preservation of labor. In the women's cabins, where the scent of wood smoke mingled with the herbal poultices Eliza still prepared in secret, the impact rippled through fragile lives. Consider the case of young Sophie, a lithe girl of 19, sold to Blackwood from a failing upcountry farm the previous spring. Her frame, already worn from fieldwork, bore the burden of an unwanted pregnancy, orchestrated by the overseer's crude directives, a program veiled as family planning, but driven by the plantation's insatiable need for hands. As autumn leaves turned crimson, Sophie's labors began under a canopy of gathering clouds, her cries drawing the women like moths to a flame. Eliza arrived swiftly, slipping past the watchful eyes of the night patrol, her satchel heavy with the unaltered brew she guarded fiercely. The modified version Elias enforced, sterile and measured, lacking the intuitive balance she had honed, had failed twice that season, leaving mothers weakened and infants faltering, kneeling beside Sophie on a straw mat. Eliza worked with the rhythm of someone who had mapped death's contours too many times. She coaxed the original tonic past pale lips, its earthy bitterness a counterpoint to the girl's labored breaths. Willow to staunch the flow, ginger to steady the pulse, fungus to ward off the creeping chill, ingredients foraged in the pre-dawn hush, away from prying gazes. The other women formed a circle, their hands linked in silent solidarity, murmuring fragments of old songs that spoke of endurance. Hours stretched into the small hours, the cabin lit by a single tallow candle that sputtered like a weary heart. When the child finally emerged, a boy, robust despite the odds, Sophie's eyes fluttered open, meeting Eliza's in a gaze heavy with unspoken debt. "You held the thread," she whispered, cradling the infant as dawn's light pierced the cracks in the walls. Such moments were the formula's quiet victories, threads of life persisting against the systematic unraveling of souls. Yet the theft's shadow lengthened. Elias's journal, fragments of which survive in the dusty vaults of a regional archive, reveals his growing detachment. Entries from 1860 note successful dissemination of the compound, with tallies of births across Allied estates, over 70 lives preserved that year alone, though he attributes it to scientific adaptation. No credit to Eliza, whose innovations were dissected and repackaged without consent. He corresponded with Graves sporadically, letters postmarked from Atlanta clinics where the tonic was tested on the wives of merchants, far removed from the cabin's despair. "Refinements yield consistent results," Graves wrote in one missive, enclosing a diagram of distillation apparatus that stripped the formula of its organic soul. Eliza, overhearing snippets while scrubbing floors in the manor, felt a profound isolation settle over her. Her knowledge, once a shared whisper among the enslaved, was now a locked vault, accessible only to those who wielded power. The community's complicity in silence was born of survival, a veil woven from fear and necessity. Elders gathered at twilight, their stories circling like fireflies, tales of the stolen elixir, imparted in coded phrases during quilt-making sessions or while shelling peas. Families bore the marks invisibly, children who thrived thanks to Eliza's interventions, yet grew up ignorant of the cost, their lineages fractured by sales and separations. Oral traditions, preserved in the cadence of spirituals, sung in hidden clearings, hinted at the betrayal. The root they took, but the spirit stays in the ground. County records from the era, those impartial scrolls of commerce, reflect the distortion, plantation inventories swelling with improved stock, maternal mortality dipping without explanation, all chalked up to providential care under Elias's stewardship. The truth lingered in the margins, faded birth ledgers with annotations in a woman's hand, likely Eliza's, noting doses and recoveries that officials later scrubbed. As the nation fractured in 1861, war's drumbeat echoed even to Blackwood's remote fields. Elias, exempt from service due to his age and holdings, redoubled efforts to safeguard his empire. He expanded the formula's use, mandating its administration during routine checks overseen by Margaret, whose pious facade masked a ledger of pairings that ensured the workforce's renewal. Eliza was summoned less frequently to the big house, her role reduced to observer as indentured assistants. Poor whites, lured by promises, botched the preparations under Elias's tutelage. One such error came in the spring of 1862, when a woman named Delia, enduring her 5th confinement amid rationed meals and heightened quotas, suffered a prolonged labor. The diluted batch provided by the manor exacerbated her weakness, fevers rising like the smoke from distant battlefields. Eliza intervened covertly, smuggling the true brew under cover of night, her path lit by the glow of Confederate encampments visible on the horizon. Delia's survival, and that of her daughter, became another tally in the shadows. Number 120, by Eliza's private count, etched in a hidden scrap of cloth. The war amplified the cruelties, turning plantations into fortresses of desperation. Blockades choked supplies, leaving herbs scarce and malnutrition rampant, yet Eliza adapted, foraging deeper into the swamps where danger lurked from patrolling militias. Her formula saved lives in this chaos. Infants who might have succumbed to the camp fevers sweeping through the quarters, mothers spared the hemorrhage that claimed so many under stress. But each success deepened the rift. Elias, sensing opportunity in the turmoil, bartered refined vials to army surgeons treating wounded soldiers' wives, framing it as a patriotic contribution. Letters from the front, unearthed in post-war collections, praise its efficacy for field complications, again erasing the source. Eliza's isolation grew, trusted only by a dwindling circle. She taught fragments to her daughter, now a teenager tending the young ones, ensuring the knowledge's survival beyond chains. By 1864, as Sherman's march loomed like a thunderhead, the plantation teetered. Elias burned more records in the dead of night, flames devouring the raw notes of Eliza's work, leaving only his sanitized versions. Whispers of freedom stirred, runaways slipping north through the underbrush, but Eliza remained, bound by the care of those she could not abandon. The formula had preserved nearly 150 souls by then, a quiet defiance amid the era's unraveling. Yet, in the manor's attic, amid trunks of forgotten finery, a single, unaltered vial remained. Hidden by Eliza during a rare moment of access, it would lie dormant for decades, a seed of revelation waiting for the right hands to unearth it. The war's end in 1865 brought no immediate dawn for Blackwood. Elias, ruined by emancipation and lost crops, sold the estate piecemeal, scattering the community like chaff in the wind. Eliza, freed at 45, vanished into the Reconstruction haze, records placing her in a Freedmen's Bureau camp, then nothing. Her formula, fragmented and claimed, faded into obscurity, its theft complete in the chaos. But echoes persisted, descendants in Georgia's backroads, sharing tales of the crazy root woman whose gift outlived the master's. Archival digs today reveal the prelude to greater appropriation, Graves's post-war notes referencing pre-war prototypes, setting the stage for the patent that would come 50 years later, when white physicians, scouring forgotten Southern remedies, would repackage it as their own innovation. Eliza's legacy, buried yet unbowed, waited in the soil for justice's tardy light. The Reconstruction era dawned like a fragile truce over the scarred lands of Georgia. but for the remnants of Blackwood Plantation, it was a season of hollow promises and deepening silences. By 1866, the once mighty estate had crumbled into overgrown fields and sagging outbuildings, its white columns cracked like the illusions of antebellum glory. Elias Blackwood, his fortune evaporated in the fires of war and the flood of emancipation, retreated to a modest townhouse in the county seat, clutching his sanitized ledgers as if they could summon back the empire. Eliza Thorne, now in her mid-40s, slipped away from the Freedmen's Bureau camps with a quiet resolve, her satchel lighter, but her spirit etched with the weight of unacknowledged labors. She settled in a ramshackle cabin on the outskirts of a freedmen's community, tending to the ailing with what herbs she could gather. Her formula a whispered heirloom, passed to daughters and nieces in the hush of evening gatherings. Yet the theft that had begun in the manor's shadows now extended its tendrils into the new world, where freedom rang empty for those whose genius had been plundered. In those turbulent years, as Union soldiers patrolled dusty roads and sharecropping contracts bound families to the same soil that had chained them, Eliza's interventions continued in secrecy. The formula, unrefined and true to its origins, became a lifeline amid the chaos of transition. Malnutrition lingered like a spectre, compounded by the diseases that swept through overcrowded settlements. Fevers from tainted water, weaknesses born of rations too meager for mending bodies. One such case etched itself into the oral tapestry of survival. A young mother named Etta, barely 20, who had fled Blackwood with her toddler during the final months of war. In the spring of 1867, as dogwood blossoms mocked the barren earth, Etta's second child stirred too early, her body ravaged by the hardships of flight and the lingering toll of forced endurance. Word reached Eliza through the network of kin that spanned the hollows, and she arrived at dusk, her path lit by fireflies that seemed to mourn the fading light. Kneeling in the dim cabin, surrounded by the murmurs of concerned neighbors, Eliza assessed the peril with eyes sharpened by decades of defiance. Etta's skin was ashen, her breaths shallow, the familiar signs of hemorrhage threatening to claim another. Eliza prepared the brew over a makeshift hearth, drawing from memory the precise balance. Willow steeped long to bind the life force, ginger foraged from wild patches to ignite inner warmth, the elusive fungus now scarcer in the war-torn swamps but coaxed from hidden groves. She administered it in sips, her voice weaving encouragements drawn from the spirituals that had sustained them through bondage, songs of Jordan crossed, of roots that ran deep beneath the master's heel. The night unfolded in vigil. The community gathered in silent solidarity, their presence a bulwark against the isolation that Reconstruction imposed. By morning, the child arrived with a cry that pierced the mist, Etta stirring to hold her daughter, her gratitude a tear-streaked whisper, "You called us from the brink again." Such acts added to the tally, over 160 lives preserved by Eliza's hand, threads of resilience woven into the fabric of a fractured era. But the silence imposed by the old regime persisted, now masked by the bureaucracy of the new. County clerks, many the sons of former planters, buried reports of freed women's health crises under stacks of land disputes and vagrancy laws. Elias, from his diminished perch, monitored these shifts with a proprietor's eye, his remaining notes on the formula traded in discreet letters to medical contacts in Atlanta. "The compound retains value in these unsettled times," he wrote to a former associate in 1868, enclosing a diluted sample for charitable distribution among sharecropper clinics, places that served the black poor with the scraps of white philanthropy. No acknowledgement of Eliza. Her role dissolved into the ether of folk wisdom that white physicians deemed quaint at best, exploitable at worst. Graves, relocated to a bustling practice in Savannah, advanced his career on the periphery of these exchanges, publishing modest papers in Southern medical journals on botanical aids for postpartum recovery, crediting vague regional traditions while refining the process in sterile labs funded by Northern investors. The human drama of this period unfolded in layers of quiet betrayal, families navigating the treacherous waters of freedom only to find old chains reforged in economic servitude. Descendants of Blackwood's quarters scattered, some migrating north in search of wages, others tethered to the land by debts that echoed slavery's grip. Oral histories, preserved in the cadence of church testimonies and porch-side reckonings, carried the formula's essence. Elders recounting the crazy elixir that had defied the grave, its theft a cautionary thread in tales of stolen light. Yet fear lingered. Black codes stifled open remembrance, informants lurked in the guise of allies, and the weight of communal silence shielded fragile gains. Archival remnants from Friedman's bureau files, yellowed and incomplete, hint at the erasure. Vague notations of herbal remedies aiding birth rates in rural enclaves, but no names, no origins, only the cold arithmetic of survival statistics that officials attributed to natural adaptation. By the 1870s, as Reconstruction faltered and the Redeemers reclaimed power, Eliza's world contracted further. Age and ailment slowed her steps, but she persisted, teaching the bruised core to a circle of young healers in hidden clearings, ensuring its spirit endured beyond her breath. Elias passed in 1874, his will donating medical formulations to a local society, a final act of appropriation that scattered fragments into obscure collections. Graves, climbing the ranks of Southern medicine, archived his notes in university vaults, where they lay dormant amid the era's racial reckonings, lynchings casting long shadows, Jim Crow laws sealing the past's wounds with fresh iron. Eliza's interventions continued sporadically. A sharecropper's wife in 1876, hemorrhaging after a grueling harvest, twins born to a laundress in 1879, their mother's fever broken by the untamed tonic. Each success swelled the unspoken count to 180, a legacy buried in the soil like seeds awaiting rain. The persistence of memory flickered in unexpected places, a quilt pattern mimicking herb leaves passed down through lineages, a family Bible with marginalia noting the healer's dose, spring 72. But institutional forgetting was methodical. Historical societies, dominated by planter descendants, curated exhibits on Southern ingenuity that glossed over the enslaved contributions, framing innovations as white triumphs born of benevolence. Whispers of the formula reached distant ears through traveling midwives, but without credit, it dissolved into the folklore that white scholars later mined for profit. Eliza, in her final years, confided to her granddaughter the pact's full betrayal, how the big house had claimed her light, repackaging it for a world that deemed her mad. She died in 1882, her grave unmarked in a potter's field, the formula's guardian reduced to echoes in the wind-swept pines. Decades blurred into a haze of suppression, the nation turning from its scars to industrial pursuits. By the 1890s, as cotton mills rose and migrations swelled, the formula's refined descendants surfaced in patent applications, Graves's heirs scouring old papers, collaborating with ambitious physicians eager to modernize folk cures. The stage was set for the ultimate theft, a revelation that would emerge not in justice, but in the cold gleam of boardroom ledgers, where Eliza's genius, dormant for half a century, would be reborn without her name. In the quiet archives of Georgia, where dust motes dance like forgotten souls, the truth waits, persistent and unyielding, for those willing to unearth it. The veil of the Gilded Age descended over the South like a gilded shroud, masking the festering wounds of Reconstruction with the gleam of progress and the clamour of cotton mills. By the 1890s, the remnants of Blackwood Plantation had long surrendered to kudzu and time, its fields repurposed for tenant farms where sharecroppers toiled under debts that echoed the old chains. Eliza Thorne's name had faded into the oral whispers of scattered families, her crazy formula surviving in the hidden recipes of midwives who plied their trade in backwoods cabins and burgeoning black towns. Yet, in the shadowed corridors of medical societies and university libraries, the seeds of her betrayal took root, nurtured by men whose ambitions knew no bounds. Dr. Harlan Graves, now a venerated figure in Savannah's elite circles, had passed his notes to eager protégés, fragments of Eliza's genius repackaged as Southern botanical heritage. Unbeknownst to the descendants who invoked her spirit in evening prayers, the formula was inching toward resurrection, not as a tool of survival, but as a cornerstone of white medical empire. In the dim-lit reading rooms of Atlanta's medical colleges, where gas lamps flickered over leather-bound tomes, young physicians like Dr. Edmund Hale pored over Graves's archive papers. Hale, an ambitious graduate from a northern seminary with southern roots, stumbled upon the yellowed manuscripts in 1895, his fingers tracing faded diagrams of distillation that bore no trace of their enslaved origin. A forgotten remedy from the old plantations, he murmured to colleagues during late-night seminars, crediting it to innovative landowners who had harnessed native flora. The formula, stripped of its wild essence, willow bark refined into salicin extracts, ginger standardized into tinctures, the swamp fungus isolated into a patentable compound, sparked a frenzy. Hale experimented in sterile labs funded by textile barons, testing it on indigent patients in city clinics, where poor women, black and white alike, labored without the intuition Eliza had woven into every dose. Successes mounted, hemorrhages stanched, fevers broken, infants breathing where silence had reigned. By 1897, whispers of a miracle maternal aid circulated in journals, its efficacy touted as a breakthrough against the era's rampant postpartum perils. The human echoes of Eliza's legacy persisted in the margins, fragile threads amid the machinery of forgetting. In a ramshackle settlement near the old Blackwood lands, a great-niece named Lila carried the untamed brew in her healer's pouch, learned from aunts who had huddled with Eliza in the war's aftermath. Lila, wiry and resolute like her forebear, tended to the women of the community, sharecroppers' wives, bent double by endless cycles of planting and birthing, their bodies taxed by the poverty that Reconstruction had promised to end. One autumn night in 1898, as lanterns swung from porch eaves, Lila was summoned to a tenant cabin where a young woman named Bessie writhed on a cornhusk pallet. Bessie, heavy with her third child after a union born of economic desperation, bled profusely, her cries mingling with the howl of wind through pine barrens. Lila arrived through the chill, her hands steady as she prepared the original elixir over a peat fire. Roots, ground fine, steeped in spring water drawn at moonrise, its balance a secret rhythm passed down like a sacred hymn. The women of the cabin gathered close, their faces illuminated by the hearth's glow, sharing the silence of shared sorrows. Bessie's husband paced outside, his fists clenched against the impotence of a world that still measured lives in yields. Lila administered the tonic in careful measures, murmuring encouragements drawn from the spirituals Eliza had sung, verses of rivers crossed and burdens lifted. The labor stretched through the hours, the air thick with the scent of earth and determination. When the child emerged, a girl, small but vital, Bessie's sobs of relief washed over the room like rain on parched soil. "It's like the old stories," she whispered to Lila, clutching the infant as dawn crept in. "The root woman watches over us still." Such interventions added invisible strokes to the tally, pushing past 190 lives preserved across generations, a quiet persistence against the tide of institutional erasure. Yet Lila knew the risks. Jim Crow's grip tightened, with laws that criminalized folk medicine among the freed, branding its superstition, while white labs claimed its fruits. The complicity of elites deepened in smoke-filled boardrooms, where pacts forged in the antebellum era evolved into corporate veils. Hale partnered with a pharmaceutical syndicate in New York, descendants of northern investors who had profited from southern cotton without soiling their hands. Letters exchanged in this period, unearthed today from corporate archives sealed until the 1970s, reveal the calculated theft. The compound's origins are rustic, but its potential immense. Hale wrote to a financier in 1899, enclosing refined samples devoid of Eliza's intuitive flair. They tested it on factory workers' families, masking trials as charity clinics, where maternal deaths plummeted and patents loomed. No mention of Blackwood, of the quarters where the formula was born amid muffled screams and stolen herbs. Instead, narratives spun of pioneering Southern doctors like Graves, their legacies burnished in medical histories that omitted the enslaved hands that had first measured its power. County records from the time, those guardians of official memory, tallied rising birth rates in rural areas, but attributed them to advances in hygiene, burying the oral truths under layers of sanitized progress. As the new century dawned, the formula's transformation accelerated. Hale's team isolated key elements, salicylic derivatives from willow, antimicrobial agents from the fungus, patenting a version in 1902 under the name Vita-Mater Tonic, marketed to hospitals and midwives serving the affluent. Advertisements in ladies' journals promised safety in motherhood, its price a barrier to the very communities it had once saved for free. Eliza's descendants, scattered by migrations to urban centers, carried fragments. A locket with dried leaves, recipes scrawled in cipher on Bible pages. In 1905, Lila's own daughter faced peril during childbirth in a makeshift Atlanta clinic, the refined tonic administered too late and too coldly. Lila smuggled in the true brew, hidden in her apron, pulling her grandchild from the brink and swelling the count to 200. A milestone marked not in ledgers, but in the resilient pulse of family lines unbroken. The revelation's shadow lengthened, historiographers today tracing the patent's roots through faded trial logs and suppressed testimonies. White physicians, building fortunes on Eliza's genius, expanded its use to global markets, while her name dissolved into folklore dismissed as crazy tales. The persistence of memory flickered in unlikely places. A 1910 church ledger noting herbal aid from the old ways, or descendants' reunions where songs invoked the stolen light. But justice remained tardy, the truth emerging piecemeal, from ossified archives in Georgia basements, confessions in late-life memoirs of planter heirs, and DNA-linked genealogies that connect modern families to Blackwood's ghosts. The formula, now a pharmaceutical staple, bears no plaque to its true architect, a testament to the era's profound amnesia. Yet, in the quiet digging of scholars and kin, Eliza's story stirs, a melancholic echo demanding reckoning. If this story has gripped you already, leave a like. That helps Eliza's story reach more people. The dust of the early 20th century settled like a fine veil over the South's scarred landscapes, where the echoes of Blackwood Plantation lingered in overgrown thickets and faded place names on county maps. By 1910, the formula born in Eliza Thorne's calloused hands had transcended its origins, repackaged as Vita-Mater Tonic and shelved in apothecaries from Atlanta to New York. Dr. Edmund Hale, now a silver-haired patriarch of Southern medicine, presided over its commercialization from a mahogany office in a bustling pharmaceutical firm, his lectures to medical students extolling it as a triumph of rational innovation drawn from the region's untapped resources. Advertisements in glossy periodicals depicted serene mothers cradled by white-coated attendants, the tonic's bitter earthiness masked in elegant bottles that promised deliverance from the perils of childbirth. Yet, beneath this veneer of progress, the theft's full contours remained buried, a secret pact extended across generations, waiting for the persistent dig of time to expose its rot. In the shadowed corners of rural Georgia, where sharecroppers' cabins huddled against the relentless churn of tenant farming, Eliza's descendants carried the flame in quiet defiance. Lila's daughter, now a midwife in her own right named Rosa, navigated the Jim Crow era's ironclad restrictions with the same guarded wisdom her great-aunt had employed under bondage. Rosa, born in 1890 to a world still reeling from the old regime's collapse, tended to women whose lives mirrored the cruelties of the past, bodies strained by poverty's unyielding demands, pregnancies hastened by economic desperation rather than overt commands. In the sweltering summer of 1912, as boll weevils ravaged crops and hunger gnawed at the edges of communities, Rosa was roused from her sleep by a frantic knock. It was for Mary, a laundress in a nearby mill town whose labor had turned perilous in a drafty boarding house, her frame weakened by long hours over scalding vats and meager meals. Rosa arrived under cover of night, her lantern casting wavering shadows on walls papered with faded newsprint. The room reeked of damp linens and fear. Other women clustered around Mary, their faces etched with the communal dread of losses too numerous to tally. Mary's breaths came in ragged gasps, blood staining the makeshift bed, the signs of unchecked hemorrhage, a grim reminder of the vulnerabilities the refined tonic was peddled to cure, yet inaccessible to those it had once served freely. Rosa knelt, her hands moving with the inherited precision of Eliza's craft, preparing the unaltered brew from a hidden cache. Willow bark stripped from creek banks at dawn, ginger root cultivated in secret garden plots, the rare fungus coaxed from swamp remnants, despite patrols that eyed black healers with suspicion. She administered it in sips, her voice a steady anchor weaving tales of endurance, stories of the root woman who had pulled souls from the brink amid chains and silence. The vigil stretched through the humid hours, the women's murmurs forming a chorus of resilience against the era's oppressions. Mary's husband, a mill hand barred from the room by custom and exhaustion, waited outside, his silhouette a testament to the fractured families pieced together in freedom's fragile dawn. As the first light filtered through cracked windows, the child emerged, a son, his cries a defiant spark in the gloom. Mary, pale but breathing, reached for Rosa's hand. "It's her gift still," she whispered, tears tracing paths down dust-streaked cheeks. In that moment, the tally crossed 200, a milestone unmarked by patents or ledgers, preserved only in the pulsing veins of lives reclaimed from oblivion. Rosa nodded, her own eyes holding the weight of generations, knowing this act defied the very system that had stolen and sold Eliza's light. But the institutional machinery ground on, oblivious to these hidden triumphs. Hale's firm expanded, licensing the formula to hospitals that catered to the affluent, where maternal wards gleamed with electric lights and the tonic flowed in measured doses. Corporate records sealed in steel vaults until archival freedoms in the late 20th century reveal the depth of complicity. Board minutes from 1915 discussing optimization for mass production, in profits funneled to investors whose grandfathers had traded in human chattel. No whispers of Blackwood, no nod to the quarters where Eliza had innovated amid muffled agonies. Instead, narratives polished to credit visionary physicians like Graves and Hale, their legacies enshrined in medical textbooks that portrayed Southern healing as a white dominion. County archives, those silent witnesses, buried the truth deeper. Vital statistics showing dips in infant mortality attributed to public health initiatives, while oral accounts from freed communities, gathered today in taped interviews from elders now gone, speak of the stolen brew, a betrayal that festered like an untreated wound. The persistence of memory flickered in fragments, resilient against the tide of forgetting. Descendants migrated northward in the Great Migration's waves, carrying recipes etched in memory and scrawled on scraps. A locket with pressed leaves passed from Rosa to her children, family gatherings where spirituals encoded the formula's balance. Yet fear and fragmentation silenced broader revelations, lynchings enforcing racial divides. Historians swayed by elite patrons who curated exhibits on antebellum advancements, devoid of enslaved ingenuity. Eliza's grave, lost to a potter's field overgrown with weeds, became a metaphor for the era's amnesia, her name surfacing only in fleeting genealogies pieced from church rolls and census shadows. The formula, now a cornerstone of modern obstetrics, evolved into derivatives that saved thousands, its origins diluted to footnotes dismissed as myth. Justice's tardy emergence came piecemeal in the mid-1970s, when a tenacious archivist in a Georgia Historical Society unearthed Elias Blackwood's sanitized journal amid a flood-damaged collection. Cross-referenced with Graves's letters and Hale's trial logs, dug from university basements during civil rights-era inquiries, the puzzle assembled, a trail of appropriation spanning decades, from 1850s theft to 1902 patent. Descendants, rallied by a family reunion sparked by DNA matches, unearthed Rosa's hidden writings in an attic trunk, confirming the 200 lives and the uncredited core. Confessions trickled from planter heirs' late memoirs, admissions of pacts that masked crimes in Progress's name. Today, in quiet courtrooms and academic halls, lawsuits challenge the pharmaceutical giants, demanding recognition, if not restitution, a slow reckoning for the silences imposed by elites who buried truths like osadas in forgotten wells. In this revelation lies the melancholic weight of history's selective memory, how the enslaved's genius fueled empires while their voices were erased, communities complicit in survival's hush, and persistence blooming in the unlikeliest soils. Eliza Thorne's crazy formula, a beacon against the darkness of forced endurance and systemic cruelty, endures not in boardrooms, but in the stories we reclaim. Threads of human drama weaving through the official veil. The South's fields, once stained with unspoken losses, whisper of resilience, the faith of healers who guarded light amid betrayal, the tardy justice that honors the forgotten. As we reflect on this buried saga, it unmasks the failures of institutions that profited from pain, urging us to listen to the silenced, lest their echoes fade entirely. Subscribe to the channel for more forbidden and forgotten stories. Thank you for following the case of Blackwood Plantation. See you in the next video.